My name is Madeline Cross. I'm 27 years old, and this is my real story. 3 years ago, I moved into an old Victorian house on the edge of Willow Creek, thinking it would be the perfect place to restart my life after a messy breakup. But what I didn't know was that the house came with a history soaked in blood and vengeance. Within weeks, I began to hear whispers in the walls, see shadows slithering in corners, and feel cold hands brushing my skin in the middle of the night. And then one evening, I found a message carved into my bedroom door: "She never forgives." I thought it was a prank, but it was only the beginning of something much darker, something that would change me forever. This is a story you won't forget. So make sure you stay until the very end to hear what happened to me. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this story to keep our channel alive. This story is written and edited by Dark Life Side Diaries. The first night the scratching began, I told myself it was just the old wood shifting the way houses sometimes grown with age. The Willow Creek house had been built in 1889, and its narrow hallways, heavy velvet drapes, and dust-choked chandeliers gave it the kind of presence that made you expect to hear a floorboard creak even when no one was walking. But this scratching was different. It came from inside the walls, deliberate, rhythmic, almost impatient, like nails dragging in slow, purposeful arcs. I tried to sleep through it, but when I turned over, I could swear I felt something watching me from the corner where the shadows pulled thicker than they should have. The next morning, I noticed tiny splinters of wood on the floor beneath the wall right by my headboard. That was strange, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe some animal had gotten in. By the third night, the scratching had grown louder, joined by what sounded like soft humming and eerie, tuneless melody that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My phone kept losing signal, and when I tried to call my best friend Leah, the call would drop after one ring. That's when I decided to start recording the nights. The first recording I played back was filled with static, but beneath it was a woman's voice, whispering my name over and over. By the seventh night, I was so sleep-deprived I started keeping the lights on, but that only seemed to make things worse. In the bright light, I could see movement, small jerking motions in the corner of my vision, things darting along the walls and ceiling like shadows that weren't mine. Then came the first truly impossible event. The hallway mirror, a heavy antique piece I'd never touched, was suddenly leaning against my bedroom door one morning, blocking my way out. On its surface, written in what looked like ash, were the words, "You're in her room." The more I asked neighbors about the house, the more their faces tightened. Most refused to say anything at all, but one old man, M.R. Hafford, finally muttered, "That house belonged to the Beaumonts. Young wife died in there, never left." He wouldn't explain more. That night, I searched the county records and found an old article about Margaret Beaumont, who was found dead in the very room I slept in, throat-slit, hands folded on her chest like someone had staged her body. The official record called it a tragedy, but some notes hinted at something darker: a husband accused but never convicted. When I went to bed after reading that, I dreamed of a pale woman standing over me, hair wet and matted eyes so black they seemed to suck the light out of the room. She whispered something in my ear that made me wake up screaming, "He'll make you pay for me." The next day, I found my clothes shredded in the closet, my bed soaked in water, and my door locked from the outside. Even though I lived alone, that's when I realized I wasn't dealing with just a haunting. I was being drawn into someone else's revenge, and the target might not even be me. Yet the morning after the water-soaked bed incident, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I sat upright in the living room with every light on, clutching a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier, my ears straining for any sound. The house seemed quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath, but there was still that faint hum, distant and almost imperceptible, like someone humming under their breath. In another room, I walked through the hallways, checking every door and window, making sure they were locked, though I couldn't explain why that made me feel safer when I knew whatever was happening here wasn't about intruders in the normal sense. Around 3 a.m., the air temperature dropped sharply enough for my breath to cloud in front of me, and I heard the front door creak open, even though I'd bolted it twice. My phone's flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on the door. Swinging gently on its hinges, a shadow slipped across the floor. Not shaped like a person exactly, but too tall to be an animal, and it moved toward the staircase, vanishing halfway up like smoke. Against every instinct, I followed the wood groaning beneath my bare feet until I reached the landing and saw her for the first time without the haze of a dream. Margaret Beaumont stood in the hallway in a black gown that seemed to ripple like it was underwater, her skin an unnatural shade of gray, her mouth opening slightly to reveal a dark, empty hollow where her tongue should have been. She raised one skeletal hand, pointing toward the attic door, and the humming stopped instantly. I don't know what possessed me, but I obeyed, pulling the string for the attic ladder, each rung protesting under my weight. The attic smelled of mildew and something coppery, and the single bulb flickered like it was about to die in the far corner beneath a filthy tarp. I found an old steamer trunk with the initials MB burned into the wood. My hand shook as I undid the rusted latch, and inside was a collection of objects that made my stomach turn. Photographs of Margaret, with her face scratched out, her wedding dress stained with something brownish-black, and at the very bottom a leather-bound journal. The handwriting inside was frantic, slanted, and smudged in places, where tears or something wetter had blurred the ink. She wrote about her husband Charles growing violent, about hearing him whisper to someone in the walls, about feeling washed even. In her own home, the last entry simply read, "If he kills me, don't let him rest." The bulb overhead buzzed, then went out, completely plunging me into total darkness, and I felt a hand close around my ankle, ice cold, with a grip so strong it made me cry out. I scrambled down the ladder, slamming the attic door shut, and didn't stop running until I was in my car in the driveway. I should have driven away right then, but the engine wouldn't turn over, and when I glanced back at the house, I saw a figure in the upstairs window, not Margaret, but a man in a dark suit, his face obscured, watching me without moving. I sat in the car until dawn, and when I finally tried the engine again, it roared to life like nothing had happened. I drove to the library to dig deeper into Charles Beaumont, but the public records had huge gaps, like whole years had been erased. An older librarian noticed my frustration and leaned over, whispering, "If you're looking for Beaumont history, you need the special archives. They keep the scandalous stuff out of public view." She led me into a locked basement room filled with dust and boxes stacked to the ceiling. In a folder marked Beaumont Private, I found a police report stating that Charles Beaumont had been suspected not only in Margaret's death, but in 3 other disappearances: 2 young women who worked as housemaids in the neighborhood, and 1 tenant who rented the back guest house, all vanished without a trace. In each case, neighbors reported seeing a tall man standing in the window the night before they were last seen. None of the bodies were ever found, and Charles was never charged. As I realized my own house matched the exact floor plan of the guest house mentioned in the file. It had been relocated to this plot decades ago, which meant I wasn't even in the main Beaumont estate. I was in the place where he likely killed those women. My stomach turned cold that night. I didn't want to be in the house at all, but with nowhere else to go and no friends nearby who believed me, I locked myself in my bedroom with a baseball bat and my phone recording again. Around midnight, the recording app picked up something I couldn't hear with my own ears, a male voice whispering right next to the phone, saying, "You'll be next." The bat slipped from my hands as the walls around me began to pulse, the paint bubbling and splitting like something alive was pressing from the other side. Fingers, pale, rotted, pushed through the cracks, followed by a sickly sweet smell, and then the whisper came again, this time in my ear, "She wants blood." Before I could react, my bedroom door slammed open, and Margaret was there, pointing directly at me, her mouth opening wide as a shriek unlike anything human poured out, shaking the light bulb until it shattered. The room went black, and something yanked me off the bed, dragging me across the floor toward the wall as if it meant to pull me. Inside, I kicked and screamed until my heel connected with something solid, and whatever it was let go. I scrambled out into the hall, heart pounding, only to see that every picture frame on the wall now held the same image: Margaret standing beside my sleeping body. I knew then that running wouldn't save me. She had bound me to this place somehow, and until I understood what she wanted, she wasn't going to let me leave alive. By the time morning came, I hadn't closed my eyes once, though. I must have drifted in and out of some delirious half-sleep, because I kept jerking awake, thinking. I felt fingertips brushing my hair. The images in the hallway frames hadn't changed. Still Margaret, still me, still that strange overlap of the living and the dead, and the longer I stared at them, the more it felt like she was shifting slightly each time I blinked, inching closer to me. In the photographs, my instinct was to destroy them, smash every frame, but a part of me was terrified of what might happen if I tried to erase her presence. Instead, I left the house and drove 2 towns over to find a psychic I'd heard about from the librarian, a woman named Eleanor who supposedly had the sight and a reputation for being brutally honest about hauntings. Eleanor's shop was a cramped, dim space that smelled of sage and old paper, and when I told her the address of the house, she froze mid-sentence and whispered, "You should not be there. That's not just a haunting, it's a tether." She explained that when someone dies with enough rage or unfinished vengeance, they can bind themselves not only to a place but to people who step into their space, feeding on the living until their revenge is fulfilled. And Margaret? I asked. Eleanor shook her head. Margaret is not the only one there. She's the one you see because she wants you to see her. The other he hides. He waits, and he's much worse. She gave me a small silver charm, telling me to keep it in my pocket and never let it leave. My body warning that it might not stop them but could delay them. When I asked how to end it, her answer chilled me more than anything you'll have. To give her what she wants, and that might mean becoming her weapon. I left her shop with the charm clenched tight in my fist, a sick weight in my stomach, because I already suspected what she meant, that Margaret wanted Charles Beaumont's soul. And if he was still lurking here as some shadow of himself, she couldn't reach him without me that night. I tried to set up cameras in every room, hoping to catch some evidence that could at least convince someone else of what was happening. The footage started normal enough, but at exactly 2:13 a.m., every single camera cut to static except the one in the kitchen. In that frame, a man in a dark suit stood by the counter, motionless, facing the corner, his head turned slightly, and though the image was grainy, I could see his mouth moving, whispering something. Then in the corner of the kitchen, a shadow began to take form. Margaret, pale and trembling like she was straining against some invisible chain, she reached toward me through the lens, and the screen went black. When I went into the kitchen, there was no one there, but the silver charm in my pocket was burning hot. So hot it scorched my palm. When I pulled it out the next morning, I drove back to the library's special archives, desperate to find anything about where Charles Beaumont's body was buried, thinking maybe that was the key to ending this. After hours of digging, I found a brittle yellowed news clipping that claimed Charles disappeared before he could be tried for murder. His body never recovered, but there was a handwritten note in the margin. See pond at Miller's Grove. Miller's Grove was less than 5 miles from my house, a patch of forest I'd driven past 100 times without giving it a thought. I went there at dusk, the charm still in my pocket, and followed the faint trail down to a stagnant pond where dragonflies skimmed the surface. That's when I saw something jutting from the water near the far bank. At first, I thought it was just a rotted log, but when I got closer, I realized it was the remains of a coffin, its wood swollen and split. The air around it felt wrong, heavy, and the water rippled as though something beneath had just moved. I didn't have time to react before the sky darkened, unnaturally fast, clouds swirling overhead, and the water erupted as a skeletal hand shot out, grabbing my ankle. I screamed, falling back onto the mud, clawing at the ground as the thing pulled itself halfway from the water, a figure in a rotted suit, jaw hanging at an impossible angle, empty sockets where eyes should have been. I knew instantly it was Charles, and he didn't move like a human. He lunged and jerked his head, twitching, his breath sounding like a wet gurgle. Then in the trees behind me, I saw her, Margaret, her black gown billowing as if in a storm, eyes locked on him. She let out a scream so piercing it made my vision swim, and Charles released me, retreating back into the water with unnatural speed. Margaret vanished too, leaving me alone by the pond, shaking and covered in mud. I stumbled back to my car, driving home in a daze, but when I got inside, I saw something that made my heart stop. On my kitchen table lay a soaking wet, mud-covered photograph of me standing at the pond, taken from no angle I could have captured myself. Scrawled across the bottom in dripping black letters were the words, "Bring him to me." I barely slept after finding that photograph. The words, "Bring him to me," burned into my mind like they'd been etched there with fire. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of wind through the old windows made me tense, certain that either Margaret or Charles or both would appear. I couldn't stop thinking about what Eleanor had said, that Margaret needed me to act as her weapon, and the memory of Charles's gaping eyeless sockets emerging from that pond kept replaying like some sick film loop. By the time the sky started to lighten, I made a decision. I was going to Miller's Grove. Again, not to run, but to finish this. I packed salt candles, the silver charm, and the only weapon. I owned a rusted hatchet I'd found in the shed when I first moved, and Eleanor had told me spirits could be bound or destroyed if they were confronted where they were strongest, but it would require me to keep them both in the same place long enough for the ritual to work. That meant luring Charles out of the water and keeping Margaret from turning on me in her rage. As I reached the edge of the pond, a thick mist was rolling over the water, curling around the trees in ghostly tendrils. I planted the candles in a circle, sprinkling salt at the edges, my hands shaking as I recited the binding words Eleanor had written down for me. The air grew colder, and the surface of the pond began to churn like something massive was moving beneath it. Then, without warning, Charles burst upward, dragging himself onto the bank, water pouring off his decayed suit, his skeletal fingers clawing into the mud. His jaw worked up and down in a grotesque mockery of speech, and though no sound came from his ruined throat, the whisper filled my head. "You don't belong here." I gripped the hatchet tighter, backing toward the salt line when the ground around the pond began to shudder, and from the mist came Margaret, her black gown trailing like smoke, her face twisted with pure hatred, not at me, but at him she didn't walk. She glided, her form flickering in and out like static on an old TV, and when she reached the edge of the water, her scream ripped through the clearing, a sound so sharp I thought my eardrums would burst. Charles staggered, his movements jerky, as if something stronger was pulling at him. I stepped forward, remembering Eleanor's warning to act, as the bridge, and shouted Margaret's name, slicing my palm with the blade of the hatchet and letting the blood drip into the pond. The water hissed like boiling oil, and Charles howled, not with sound, but with a psychic wail that clawed at the inside of my skull. Margaret lunged, her hands sinking into his chest, and I saw her fingers dig through what little flesh remained, pulling something black and writhing from inside him. The thing, his soul, or whatever was left of it, fought to get away, twisting like smoke in her grip, but she held fast, her face breaking into a grim smile. "You're mine," she whispered, and for a moment I could see her not as the vengeful spirit, but as the young woman in the photographs, alive, beautiful, and burning with righteous fury. Then she looked at me, her eyes softer than they'd ever been, and said, "It's done." Charles's body collapsed into the mud, dissolving into nothing, and the pond stilled as if nothing had disturbed it in decades. The mist began to fade, the air warming slightly, and Margaret's form started to dissolve into the dawn light. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, and then she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of roses in the air. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the water, half expecting Charles to return, but the silence was deep and unbroken. When I finally returned home, the house felt different. Lighter somehow, but the hallway frames were empty, their glass cracked as if something had shattered inside them. I took them all down, piling them in the yard, and set them ablaze, watching the smoke rise into the morning sky. I haven't seen Margaret since, but sometimes when the wind rattles the old shutters, I think I hear her humming faintly, as if she's still watching over me. I moved out of Willow Creek not long after, but I've never stopped wondering if freeing her also freed something else, something that might be following me even now. Thanks for staying with me through the end of my story. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe, like, and share so more people can experience these true life nightmares. And remember, sometimes the past doesn't stay buried.